All right, so welcome and thank you everyone for joining our office hours. Today we're diving into the realm of experiments and exploring how homemade phantoms and gamification can enhance POCUS training. I'm Mona Khattab. I'm a neonatologist at Texas Children's Baylor College of Medicine in May.
Hi everyone, I'm Chen. I am a neonatologist at Johns Hopkins Children's Center in Baltimore, Maryland.
Next slide.
Sorry, gotta make sure it moves.
Okay, so before we begin, we would like to disclose that we have no affiliation with any of the products that we will be discussing today. We will explore how homemade phantoms and gamification can enhance ultrasound training, making it more accessible, engaging, effective, and fun. So let's take a moment to hear from our audience first. How many of you have used POCUS phantoms? Please respond to the poll question.
About 58%, 66% participating. Almost there. I'll give it one more minute.
Oh, okay.
All right. Wow. Okay.
50-50.
50-50.
Great. So looks like many of you have experience with phantoms. Now, how many in our audience have made their own phantoms?
Our next poll question. One more second.
All right, so thank you all for sharing. It seems like 22% of our audience have made their own phantoms, which hopefully will make this session more interactive and fun. So as you all know, people learn best in a fun, interactive environment. And we'll look at the next slide. May, please.
Yeah. I guess my one question is for those the two folks who actually did make your own phantoms, like what have you guys used? If people are willing to share.
I'm April, University of Miami. I used Metamucil. It was a recipe I got off one of the, I think it was Adult EM Docs websites.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thanks, April, for kind of chiming in, especially while you're driving. Drive safely.
Yeah, sorry.
Awesome.
We've used one from St. Louis Children's Hospital. We used one. The first go was just using Jello, and then the second one I found a agar mix from anesthesia case report or report on using it, and that's a little bit better.
And you use the shrink tubing. Talk about that too.
Oh yeah, for the actual vessels, I've used like heat shrink tubing for wiring, and so you can get it in small sizes here for neonatology, down to I think like 0.8 millimeters, which is pretty much similar to our very, very small ones.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Could you actually get the agar and or the Jello firm enough for the mold?
The Jello definitely broke apart much more quickly and was very like friable with, one or two pokes. The agar seems to be more durable. And actually this paper that I found talked about different consistencies and used 2% versus 5% versus 10%. And so I followed the 5% recipe because that's what they found to be the most, kind of balancing both the density versus the ability to poke it multiple times.
Nice. It's so interesting. Well, thank you guys for sharing. I mean, I think, Mona and I are going to talk about two different kinds. I'd use gelatin and then Mona does ballistics gel. So we'll kind of cover through some of that, but we'd love to hear, please feel free to chime in, add comments in the chat, because we really want to kind of have this as a conversation and have everyone kind of talk about their experiences with phantoms and gamification.
Yeah, it's very interesting, especially actually about the Jello, because that was the initial thought when I was just looking for test trainers, how to make one. Is like the Jello was first one, but is it really that durable to sustain the pressure from a probe? Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and start with the presentation. So as you all know, people learn best in a fun, interactive environment. For example, at PCM, we created this dance for the probe movement for our novice learners to make it more fun and engaging, and it's in line with the adult learning theory. We called it the PCM New POCUS dance, and we've been displaying it actually at the start of every workshop since we created it. So May, if you can please play it. I can't really hear the sound, but you can see the movement.
Yeah, if you couldn't hear it, I apologize, but really I think Mona and their BCM POCUS dance was great because it kind of shows you how to, probe manipulation in a really fun, interactive way. And then I think it'd be really fun if the whole group did it.
Yeah, we were cheering for the dancers. Okay, so now we will proceed with our agenda to discuss the homemade phantoms and gamification ideas for POCUS education.
So I think we're, just want to put a plug in that there's, I think, a lot of benefits of a homemade phantom. I think one, and first and foremost, is that it's pretty cost effective. Some of the commercial phantoms are quite expensive. They're great, they're durable, but when you're kind of working on a shoestring budget sometimes as you're starting, finding more cost-effective ways to teach is really helpful. It's also customizable and they're pretty effective, and there's some pretty realistic simulation with them. So we found that it's been really helpful for part of our education. And then there's, as people kind of had chimed in the beginning, there's a couple of different materials that you can actually use to make the phantoms. I think agar is really cool and something that I may have to kind of consider myself. But as I mentioned, I do predominantly gelatin because I will admit that I don't always plan ahead and I need to kind of work on a tighter time scale. Mona does ballistics gel, but then there's also a lot of the adult EM, and there's some literature out there also about tofu blocks and konnyaku, which is like a yam cakes that have done. There's actually a paper about this konnyaku jelly for a vascular access phantom. And besides agar, has anyone used any other materials that we haven't thought about? There's no poll question for this. I'll even throw out a couple. Tofu for sure. I saw one of people using Spam for their phantoms. I also saw one for like doing a lung phantom. They used pork belly for the ribs. So a little bit more food-based, so you got to be careful with using your probes, but lots of other materials and ideas you could potentially consider. So for today, we were just going to focus on two different kinds of materials. The kind of pros and cons and talking through how to make gelatin and ballistics gel phantoms. So I use gelatin. I think some of the pros of gelatin is that it's still pretty realistic. They're pretty quick to make, and you can really use supplies that I go across the street to Target and buy them and then come home and make the phantoms. And you can use, they're pretty easy to color with just some food coloring. Mona, how about you? Ballistics gel?
So ballistics gel provides a realistic ultrasound imaging that mimics the acoustic properties of human tissue, and I find it really realistic, making it lifelike ultrasound experience. Also offers uniform density and texture, so learners can get the consistent ultrasound images across different training sessions. It also allows you to tailor the phantom designs to specific anatomical structures or pathologies, depending on your training needs. And ballistic gel is also very durable and can withstand multiple needle insertions without significant degradation. And this durability actually prolongs the lifespan of the training phantoms, making it cost effective in the long run. And they actually use ballistic gel for ammunition testing. There's like a lot of videos online if you want to watch it. So, and a big pro that I would give to ballistic gel is that it is reusable. So despite that, it might seem like a big purchase in the beginning, you can clean it and remelt it many times before it starts to degrade. I have been using one block that I purchased over 2 years ago, and I have not had to buy another one so far. Now let's ask our audience if you have used gelatin or ballistic gel. In what other pros have you identified that we did not mention here?
Please feel free to add in the chat or unmute yourselves. I know there's at least a few here who do ballistics gel and gelatin.
I definitely have used gelatin. And I really highly recommend not using the orange flavored Metamucil, because that combination of scents honestly is something that I will never be able to unsmell. But yeah, so that was certainly an eye-opening thing for me. But yeah, I mean, very, very quick to make, very like realistic, easy to make, right? And yeah, very, I thought honestly that the tissue properties were really nice in ultrasound.
Yeah. That's so funny, Karina, because one of my colleagues, they're like, oh, it kind of smells good. It smells like orange.
Oh no.
Yeah, I am a big proponent of using ballistic gel. I've actually never used anything else. One of my mentors had used ballistic gel, so that's what I've always used. And she had taught me to add an other raw material like glass microspheres and stearine and other things that you can just get at the craft store to adjust the tissue properties to make it look like various things in the human body. So I've had a lot of fun playing with that. Way too many hours spend over a crock pot on my free weekends for sure.
Thanks, guys. All right. Well, there's always a plus and a minus sometimes. So there are a couple of cons when it comes to using gelatin. It doesn't last as long. I've learned. So especially if you're using it for like a vascular access phantom, you can only really stick a needle through it a couple of times before you can kind of see the needle tracks, and then the gelatin itself kind of breaks down. It's also not as durable, and you do have to keep it at a certain temperature. You have to keep it cool, because when it gets too warm, it gets a little soft. So then it doesn't work as well. And the other thing is, because gelatin is still a food product, it can be prone to mold. So even though you can keep it in the fridge for a couple of days, and I've kept it for like a week, longer than that, sometimes you're kind of more prone to mold. And then I think ballistic gel has a couple of cons too.
Yeah, so ballistic gel can be relatively expensive compared to other material. However, it is reusable, as I mentioned before, and it requires specialized equipment. So achieving the desired consistency and bubble-free structure can be really challenging and is very time consuming, especially if you're like me, someone who does not feel comfortable leaving the house with the oven on. Safety is more concern when using ballistic gel versus gelatin, because there is risk of combustion and releasing toxic fumes or even fire if not following the product instructions. And certain material will melt with ballistic gel. So for example, you can't use balloons or weak plastic objects and have to use like heat resistant products, for example, heat resistant glue or paint when you're working with ballistic gel. And back to the audience again, let's ask our audience if you have used gelatin or ballistic gel, what other cons have you identified?
I would say the heat for sure. I identify with the ballistics gel. Like, it'd be very cautious that you're not burning your fingers when pouring, or right after you pour. Sometimes I would touch the very hot ballistics gel, and so I have to be very careful with that. I do mine in a crock pot outside, usually in my garage. At first, I did it in the kitchen, and my husband stopped that very quickly because just of the generalized like plastic smell that it makes that he did not find appetizing. So when I was in Cleveland, we would do it in our attic, and now that I'm in North Carolina, I do it outside. But I would say that that is a little bit of a con because I try to only do it when it's nice outside, so I'm not like it's not raining and gross.
Yeah, Carabeth, I unfortunately don't have as much of an outdoor space, so I have yet to use ballistics gel, especially because my husband's like, you can't do that in the kitchen. Alrighty.
I've definitely found that in terms of the gelatin and the durability of it, that certainly is for sure a con. Left some phantoms out for the course of like a workshop, and towards the end of that workshop, you could even feel that the consistency of the phantom had already changed, just even really just sitting there at room temperature. I mean, I guess it had been handled a fair amount with, people touching it, so maybe a little bit of body temperature raise the temperature too, but yeah, definitely the durability.
Yeah, that's for sure. Definitely. Cool. All right. Well, we're gonna jump right in. We're gonna kind of teach you how we make our phantoms. So I'm gonna start with teaching kind of the audience and talking through with the audience, like how do I make my gelatin phantoms, and I'll show you a couple of examples. So this is kind of like the recipe card that you would have in your kitchen if you were making like soup or pasta or something. But this is the recipe card for gelatin phantoms. I use warm, slightly hot water. I use an electric kettle. So there's a picture here of kind of essentially what my kitchen setup looks like when I'm making these phantoms. I will admit that I do use a scale that I use for baking to measure out the gelatin, but you don't have to. I use an electric kettle. I do 500 mLs of warm or hot water. It's 40 grams of gelatin. It comes out to be about 4 tablespoons. 2 tablespoons of sugar-free Metamucil. I do use the orange flavored one. And definitely sugar-free, because if you don't use sugar-free, you're going to have to change the kind of concentration of the Metamucil. And then I just use any kind of food coloring that I buy at Target. And then when you make it, so I measure out all the powder, the gelatin and the Metamucil. I throw it into this, like my mixing bowl, and I slowly add the water. So kind of like how you make a gravy, you start with the roux, you add the water in, and then you slowly add more water in. And then as that powder dissolves, you kind of want to mix it well. Don't want to mix it too fast. So you can't use like a electric mixer or anything like that, because that'll create too many bubbles. And then I remove some of the surface bubbles. I'll add any food coloring if I want. And then I pour it into a mold. And usually I pour it into like a Tupperware container, like one that you can see kind of up here with these little animals. And there's just a couple of things to remember when you're actually pouring the gelatin and having it set. So one of them is like bubbles. Bubbles are hard because you want to make sure that you try to remove as many bubbles as you can, because that'll affect how you scan. So usually by the time I've mixed it in a bowl, some of the bubbles will usually rise to the very top. And so I just lay a piece of saran wrap over the top, and then I can slowly, like gently pull it towards the edge. And with that, I can remove most of the surface bubbles. And then once I pour it into the mold, I let it set. I like tap it a little bit and I'll let it sit. And then some of the bubbles will come up to the surface. And then you can actually take a piece of paper towel and like slowly dip out the little bubbles. And that works pretty well. And then the other thing that most people sometimes ask me is like, how long does it take to solidify? Like, is it like Jurassic Park where the Jello is super jiggly, or when does it harden? So usually for me, I do it at night, and then by morning, they're nice and solid. You can see a couple of them sitting in my fridge. And it's food grade product, so it's safe. So it sits next to the keto bread that we have. And I would say it usually takes about 6 to 8 hours if you're really short on time. That should be sufficient to cool and solidify. And then, like Karina had mentioned too, it does get soft when it's warm. So in between sessions, if you're not using it, put it back in a fridge or something. And then you can also create layers. So you can adjust the amount of Metamucil you do. I once ran out of Metamucil, so I only had like a little bit, and you could see like 2 different layers when it came to my phantoms. So definitely you can create different layers as you need. And then the last thing just to remember is that if you're using food coloring, wear gloves and use probe covers. because the gelatin, the food coloring in the gelatin can then stain your fingers and the probe. So you want to make sure to kind of protect that. And then I was just going to show a couple of very quick photos of the phantoms that I've made recently. So one of them was an LP phantom. I bought like 2 different spine models from Amazon, and they were about like $30-ish each. And then I disarticulated them. And then I put 1 layer of gelatin first. I poured it, let it cool, let it solidify just a little bit, and then laid the spine in so that they were not like flipping around, and then pour the rest of the gelatin over it. And here's one of my colleagues kind of scanning the spine model with the spinous processes you can see on the ultrasound. And then the other model I recently made is just a bladder model. These were very full bladders. I should have made one maybe a little bit more depressed. But you can see that I just laid them in the Tupperware. I poured the mold over. You can see how the surface looks pretty smooth, and that's an ultrasound scan. And we used it for one of our teaching sessions with the fellows. We're gonna move on to ballistics gel. Mona's gonna go through that, but if just, you know, does anyone have any questions about making the gelatin phantoms at all before we kind of move on? Happy to field any, and I'm happy to field questions in the chat too.
All right. So for the ballistic gel, you will need 10% ballistic gelatin FBI block. The amount you will need will vary per the container or the task trainer that you're trying to build. You will need the mold release agent to easily remove the ballistic gel from the container, but it's not a must. You can still get the ballistic gel out of the container without using this agent, but it just makes it easier. You will need a brown or black tone dye just to make it opaque and more like a skin tone. And the molds where you will be melting the ballistic gel. So you can use foil or Pyrex or metal molds, and constant heat source to maintain 250 degrees. So I use the oven. Some people use the slow cookers like Carbet does, and I use my kitchen. You can, like some people do it in the garages. So next slide, please. So to make the ballistic gel mold or test trainer, you first will start by like tear or cut gel into small pieces, then place the gel in the mold. The smaller the pieces, the less time it will need to melt in the oven. And prior to preheating the oven, you will need to cover the oven rack with aluminum foil to evenly disperse the heat. It also protects the oven from spills and long-lasting fumes if you get spills. And it happened for me before. And I was like, where is this smell coming from? And it was previous spill from my ballistic gel. Also, overheating will result in combustion if the gel temperature exceeds 275 degrees. So just be careful about that. The gel becomes very hot, so handle with extreme caution to avoid severe burns. And it takes average 4 to 6 hours for the gel to melt. However, it will need to stay with the heat source or in the oven for almost 12 to 18 hours to get rid of the bubbles and make it more realistic test trainer. You may use a heat gun to get rid of the bubbles that rise close to the top surface and minimize the time in the oven, but I can't see that it will take less than 12 to 18 hours total time. So be prepared to be available for that time. And if you're coloring the gel, then as you can see in the picture, after you melt the clear ballistic gel, you can cut small pieces of the dye block into small pieces as well and stir it with the clear gel when it all melts together. And if you've made a clear task trainer and you don't want to remelt it and start all over, I have had success with just making a thin colored layer of ballistic gel and placing the clear task trainer on top and adhere to it and make the surface opaque when it cools down. You should allow the gel to cool down to room temperature before removing from the mold, and this may take up to another 10 hours to completely solidify, especially if you're creating small blood vessels to avoid collapsing as well. Also remember that pouring gel on top of objects or body part models that you may be using will result in creating more air bubbles and needing several hours in the oven again. Also, it's very important to make sure that you use objects that withstand heat in making your models. Any questions so far? Also with the ballistic gel, I find that depending on the mold that I'm melting the gel in and letting it solidify in, it will take the impression of that foil container, for example. So also be mindful if you want your surface to look like skin and smooth like skin. Next slide.
And Mona, there was a question in the chat that I think as we look at your UVC, UAC trainer, that'll be helpful is what have you found to be the best vessel to use for vascular access? And I could say that for the gelatin, sometimes you can just like literally put like a straw or a like a skewer, and then I pour the mold over, like if I've made a hole in my Tupperware. And then as it solidifies, I can kind of pull that out and that can be the vessel. But Mona has some other thoughts too for ballistics gel.
Yeah, now I'm going to talk about it with the UVC, UEC. I don't have a slide for the vascular access test trainer because it's pretty similar to the UEC and UVC test trainer. I use metal straws. And I've had actually luck with it because it can sustain the temperature for a long time in the oven. But also if I make just a clear test strainer or like mold in the oven using the foil, I can leave it in the oven for hours. And then when I'm ready, I'll just make a hole in the foil itself and place the metal straws on different levels. So make like a shallow vessel and a deeper vessel as many like number as I want.
Can I ask a question? If you use a slow cooker, so once you melt the ballistic gel, you are going to pour into another mold, yes?
Yes, actually Karabeth uses the slow cooker. And she we have had this talk before, and she pours it in a mold and she doesn't have to get rid of bubbles. Karabeth, if you can unmute and
yeah, sure. So yes, you do have to pour it into another mold, a mold that is not prone to melting really easily. And so that's one of the first things to consider, like when you're choosing what mold to put it in. I use a lot of 3D printed molds actually, which are pretty resistant to heat. So I have an infant torso mold. So that way, if we flip it over, it looks like the front of an infant torso, like for our UVC trainers and things like that. But it is pretty hot when you first pour it in, which is whenever I have gotten encountered the most heat, tiny burns, but it's not too bad. And then for some of the material, it's really trial and error. Sometimes the gel is a little too hot for whatever material I'm trying to put it in. So I may let it sit for like 10 to 20 minutes and let that initial heat wear off. And then I'll input whatever it is I'm using for the trainer. So whether it's like a metal skewer for vessels. So I will put in like a long skewer sometimes and then let it cool and remove that afterwards. Latex tubing I've used, or for my UVC, for my like simulated heart chamber, I will put in a ping pong ball with a latex tubing attached to it, and then actually remove the ping pong ball afterwards. So it ends up just being a negative space of kind of like a circular chamber. But yes, I have found that sometimes that it's too hot, and then not only is it too hot for some of the things I want to put in there, but then things may either fall to the bottom of the mold or rise to the top. So if you're trying to make it sit more in the middle, if you let it cool a little bit, you can better determine or dictate like where that inside material will lay. So that way you have a little bit more control over where your vessels will be.
So you place the metal skewer and take it off and introduce the tubing in the place of the metal skewer for IV line,
No, those would be for different like materials. So the metal skewer would definitely be thinner. I would put the metal skewer in and then just remove that. And then that would just be a negative space, kind of how Mona's talking about using the metal straws and then she removes afterwards. So it just leaves that negative space. You don't have anything else. You can also, there is a decent amount of latex tubing that is ultrasoundable that I just get at like Home Depot if I want some things that are a little bit larger. Or if I want it to be like a defined space that I can then put a catheter through, and I want to make sure that that space holds its structure for a long time. Sometimes I'll use latex tubings for those things, but usually I don't use one and then the other. It just depends on what model I'm making and how big I want the vessel to be.
Thank you.
Oh, that's a good point. And Karina just put Penrose drains from Amazon work well too for creating some of these like vessels. And yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and I think the ballistic gel is really good at keeping the space that you create holding together just by the consistency of the ballistic gel. Like when I remove the metal straw, I just like make a couple of turns and make sure that the gel is completely cooled down, like the 10 hours. So when I remove the metal straw, the space is maintained. It does not collapse because now it's like solid. All right, so this is our LP task trainer and using a spine model. So I inserted a plastic tube in the middle filled with water to simulate the epidural space and scanned using my butterfly probe to make sure it works. And it really was an easy task trainer to make. Didn't take much work other than the regular process of and the time that it has to spend in the oven. Next. Creating our bladder tab task trainer was really so much fun. So using the pelvis model that comes with the spines, I first experimented with the balloon to simulate the bladder that did not sustain the heat, and air kept expanding with the prolonged heat exposure. And also the model itself kept turning as the air was like expansion happened inside the balloon. So it worked with using a plastic bowl from my kids' old toys. I melted the gel first, inserted the pelvis to the melted gel with the plastic bowl inside, and then let it sit in the oven as long as it needed to get a decent amount of bubbles out. Then I removed the bowl from the back and sealed the hole with a layer of hot gel. Then fill the empty space with water. And first picture shows the bladder scan, and second shows the bladder tab procedure, and you can see the needle very clearly in. And I loved how it came out.
And I think, Mona, you bought the same spine model, right?
Correct, yes.
I'm sending the Amazon link to Karina so that maybe she can add to the chat. But the spine models that I bought, like it was like $30, and you had both the spine and you had the pelvis. So we used the pelvis for the bladder phantoms and then the spine for the lumbar puncture. So it was kind of like a 2-for-1 deal.
Yep. And next, please. And this is our UEC and UVC task trainer. So I started by inserting the spines in the melted gel, then placed 2 metal straws to represent the aorta and the IVC in the anatomically correct positions. Poured more gel to cover the top and placed it in the oven to get rid of bubbles. When it cooled down completely, I took the straws out. And as I mentioned before, like I make few turns back and forth, and like just to make it sure that the space is patent. And I inserted the umbilical catheters and injected it with water. You can also use fake blood using red food coloring instead of water. And here is how it looked when scanning using the butterfly probe. So you have the landmark of the vertebrae in the back.
And then the UVC one too.
The UVC. And for the UVC, you can see the UVC when the probe is tilted slightly to the right side of the task strainer, just like they would do in real life, tilting a little bit to the right of the patient. This slide is actually for you to screenshot if you're interested in saving the recipes.
And then there's a link on the bottom that is like a ultrasound phantom compendium. It's mostly adult stuff, but it has a huge list of different kinds of phantoms you can make, homemade, and lots of different materials. So give people a second if they want to screenshot it.
Mona, we've got a question in the chat for you here about what is the longevity of these task trainers?
Oh, good question. I'm still using my task trainers, vascular access, and umbilical lines that I made 2 years ago. It looks a little deteriorated, like the edges are not as crisp. It's more cloudy because of the gel on top, like old gels. Sometimes they were like not completely cleaned after, but I still have the vessels. All what I need to do before workshops is just inject more fake blood inside the vessels.
How do you store it to maintain it like that?
I don't have to do anything for storing other than put it in my office in a closet in my office. Make sure just you don't put anything on top, because as I mentioned before, it will take the impression of whatever container you put it on. So make sure it's on a flat surface and nothing on top. So you will need significant space if you're making like 10, 15 models. Any other questions?
This is a question for both of you guys, actually. So whenever I've made these models, especially for the fluid-filled models, I've played around with different ways of putting the fluid in and way to instill the fluid in your models. Do you use needle and syringe? Do you put it in through a different way? Do you have your tubing come out the side that you place it in? What do you guys choose to do?
I use a needle and a syringe, but if I have already an umbilical catheter inserted in, then I inject in the umbilical catheter directly, and it leaks from the umbilical catheter to the vessel and fills it up. Before I store it, I typically take all the like fluid that I injected out, just because it is food color, so I just don't want to leave it there. And with the vessels, sometimes just immediately before the workshops, I would put the metal straws again inside the vessels that it already made there, just to make sure it's patent and I will have no issues with it. And so far it's working, as I mentioned, like over 2 years now.
And it's super cool because I've learned so much from Mona too doing this, where she kind of uses a little bit of that ballistics gel and then puts it at sometimes the edge of the phantom, right, Mona? And then you can melt it to even like close off one side and then fill the fluid with the other. For the gelatin ones, I will say that the bladder one, for instance, is just enclosed in the balloon. And because the gelatin phantoms don't really last for me past a couple of sessions, I usually don't need to refill it because I tend to like just remake it.
So I have bought like after talking to Kara, like, thank you so much for giving me instructions. I have brought the supplies. How many phantoms can I make with that big block that I got?
Oh, we actually have it on this slide. So also this slide is for you, as of course, it's very important to be aware of average cost of each material you may use before deciding what material you will use. So we've prepared this slide for you to take a screenshot as well, and just keep in mind what I mentioned earlier, that ballistic gel models are reusable. So for the big block that I have, so far I have made like almost 20 task trainers, medium sized, like for umbilical lines and vascular access in the bladder and the spinal tap. And if I run out, I still have some left, like from the block. I didn't completely finish the block,
so
but I can remelt it again.
But you cut them into small pieces and then take whatever is needed for the how many you are making instead of melting everything. Yes, is that right?
Yeah, so you don't melt the entire block at once. You just cut like slices as if you're cutting like toast.
Mm-hmm.
And then with my hand, because it's faster, I just cut it into small pieces. That just minimizes the time to melt in the oven. I know people who use the crock pot, they use higher heat, so they don't have to cut it into small pieces. But I'm trying to play more safe at my kitchen. And whatever container you use, you just make sure that you fill it to the top. Don't overfill it because you don't want it to spill to the sides, which it happened, as I mentioned before. And the spillage actually will stick to your oven, and your oven will smell for a while afterwards, every time you turn it on.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? And I'm obviously not biased at all to ballistic gel. I only use ballistic gel.
So I have brought all supplies other than the spine and all these extra items that I would need. So hopefully I will be making in next couple of weeks. So we'll let you know.
Manjula, I think if you need any help, certainly feel free to reach out to any of us.
Okay.
And we can always help and give suggestions and.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. All right. So I think one of our initial posters who kind of posted about how they use the Halloween skeleton and sponge for lungs for demonstrating beelines and consolidation, unfortunately jumped off, but sounds like it's an option. I do have a colleague who's in PZM who bought a whole model skeleton off Amazon and has used many different pieces of it in ballistics gel in his garage. So I think a John Deere tractor might have been involved as well. So lots of great options and possibilities. All right, any other questions about phantoms? We're going to kind of do a quick 10 minutes about gamification for POCUS education. All right, cool. So here. We wanted to kind of switch gears just a little bit because I think making phantoms is fantastic, but how do you use those phantoms to teach POCUS? And I have found that integrating kind of game elements into kind of these contexts has really helped and can kind of transform some of the learning and kind of applies these competitive challenges to the learning process. I guess my question for the group is, do you guys have experience with gamification in POCUS? I love this question because I have 100% answered 13 of 13. Well, 13 folks have answered and 9 of you guys have said no, you don't have any experience. And then 4 of you said, what is that? So I think this is the whole point of us. Sorry, should I share the results? I think this is the whole point of us doing some of this too. So gamification is kind of integrating these game elements into this non-game kind of teaching context. So some of the benefits of gamification in POCUS training is, I think it provides a little bit more engagement. It can really facilitate our competitive spirit sometimes. It really allows for more motivation, retention of skills, really fostering kind of skill development and then teamwork as well, and gives some collaboration and feedback. So lots of, I think, great aspects and benefits to gamification. And there's a couple of different examples and strategies for gamification. So we listed some of them here. You can do quizzes and challenges. Simulated cases is still one of them. Badges and rewards. You could do a leaderboard. So people scan certain things and you get certain points. And then over time, who's on the leaderboard. And then virtual competitions and challenges. So I'll give you a couple of examples of things that either I've done with my fellows or I've seen with some of the ultrasound competitions at some of the other ultrasound conferences. So PD Sonofest is one of them that they do at AAP in the PEDS EM world. If you ever get the chance and you're there, they welcome folks coming to watch and cheer on the teams. You can pick up a couple of ideas there. And one of the ideas that I actually picked up there this last year was Matt Kasulis, who's a PEM physician at Cohen Children's. He had a kind of charm game where he had these like panda charms, and he put them at the bottom of a Tupperware, covered it with gelatin, basically. And the fellows and the learners had to basically scan and find those little panda charms and then thread a needle through the top of that charm. So I'm from Maryland. I teach in Maryland. So in Baltimore, we are a big crab city. And so I had to get these crab charms. I bought them on Amazon. I got like 40 of them. And I just used the glue gun. I glued it to the bottom of this Tupperware container, covered it with gelatin. And then my fellows had to, for one of our like procedure potpourri courses, I had them scan and find the crabs. And so there are two things I could have done with this. One is I gave them 5 minutes and they had to just find as many as they could. And in order to find them, this is what it looked like on ultrasound. So you had to be able to show me this kind of crab. Use a linear probe, and then you just kind of scan. And then if they weren't fully on target, it really taught really good fine motor skills. And so that was really, really fun. The other one similar to that is I then bought these letter charms and spelled out a certain word. And in this here, I spelled out Baltimore and Hopkins, covered it with the gelatin mold, and then had them do the same scanning. So they had to look for the letters, and then they had to tell me what the word was. So it was kind of like a fill in the letters. And I think only 2 groups were able to find both words. There's also lots of kind of, I think my fellows actually really enjoyed doing this particular game. One, because, you know, it kind of brings on that spirit of like, okay, let me see if I can find out what it is. But at the same time, they learned a lot just doing fine motor, like small movements made the biggest difference in terms of finding these letter charms. And when we're putting in, arterial lines or IVs in these little like 23, 24-week babies, like these small movements make a difference. So that was a really nice skill for them to learn. The other things, kind of, I'll throw out a couple of other ideas for you guys. Feel free to take them back, kind of get creative. But this is something from the Academy of Emergency Ultrasound from SAEM. This is on the adult side. I hope some people on this call remember beer pong in college. So this is kind of that idea. So you have 2 groups and these, the red solo cups that you think of and 2 ping pong balls. And each team then stands away and you have to throw the ping pong ball into the opponent's cup. And in each cup is a piece of paper that tells you what you have to scan. So you may have to, like up here, you may have to find the ocular nerve. This is more adults. So you can change it to how you want to do it in neos, but like look for the IVC and the long axis. So they get that, they go back and they have to find the IVC and the long axis maybe on each other or on one of our simulators. So that's one kind of other game, but it kind of reinforces the different kind of scans that you may have already reviewed with them. So if we did a lot of vascular access, UVC, IVCs, then they could kind of go back and practice that, but in a like really fun environment. There is a link here for AUS. They have a lot of other kind of game ideas too. So if you just search them, you can look up Gamification AUS and you'll be able to find them. This other one was also really fun. Also, Matt kind of did this. So I called it blindfolded POCUS. So you have basically training learners how to teach ultrasound and teach POCUS. So the first learner is blindfolded, and that's the person who's going to be scanning. So they have the ultrasound probe. And the second learner has to use verbal cues to guide learner 1 to obtain a necessary view. So we may say, okay, I want to see the right upper quadrant view, see Morrison's pouch. And so the first learner blindfolded has to find that image while the second learner is telling them, okay, you have to like slide your probe, okay, go more in inferior or superior, and then to find that view. It's a little bit more of an advanced skill, I will say, because it does require the second learner to have some familiarity with the task and the ultrasound view. So you may have to change that depending on the experience of your learners. But you can give them like a 5-minute time period and then have a list of things that they have to find, and however they get points for however many that they find. And then I think the very last one I was just going to show the group is that for POCUS Atlas, if you don't know, it is an app that's great. There's a POCUS Atlas Junior too, with lots of great images for pediatrics. But they, on their website, if you look up POCUS Atlas Jeopardy, you can actually download a Jeopardy version for POCUS. You can download it both in Keynote and PowerPoint. It's made by Dr. Rachel Liu, who is in, I want to say she's adult EM, and so it has some adult EM principles, but it's already created. Like that PowerPoint is created for you to like change around for your own Jeopardy playing with your learners. So it's kind of nice because you don't have to do all that work of setting up the PowerPoint. You can just change some of those elements. So that's kind of a little taste, I think, of what gamification can look like for POCUS in our education and our teaching.
Thank you. So be ready to be flexible, get creative, look around in your home for objects that you can use to build your task trainers before buying the supplies. And for gamification, we've had our workshops head towards competitions between fellows and attendings as learners on doing the procedures. So it might come natural, but this is like basically we're competitive as in the medical field, and we will like reward system would be who gets the procedure done faster and gets scored, and just like cheerleading for that person makes it part of fun learning as well. And now let's open it up for our audience. Do you have any other experiences with phantoms and gamification? We would really love to hear from everyone. You can unmute and talk.
Thank you, Mona, and thank you, May. I think this is really fantastic what you guys shared. This is I've been doing ultrasound for a few years now, but I've never been part of this of creating simulation mannequins. And this is something we are also kind of struggling with in our institution. We have mannequins that are ultrasound compatible, but they're all adult sized. And I don't think there are at least affordable mannequins out there that are neonatal sized. And I didn't even know that you could create one. So that is amazing. And I hope this session was recorded because we really are going to start working on this. But this is very, very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah. So, I think, and I think I'll speak for myself certainly, but if anyone ever needs any help or has questions, really feel free to reach out. I can put my email in the chat. Certainly I don't do ballistics gel phantoms, but someday when I can make it in my garage. But happy to kind of chat through some of those other aspects too. And I'm sure Mona's been super helpful in kind of sharing with me and teaching me about ballistics gel phantoms. So.
Oh, thank you so much, May. I learned from you too. I actually tried also using the alphabets and the charms, just like May is doing. I bought the same exact ones she told me about, and it worked on the ballistic gel as well. The only thing that I learned is I need to actually glue it to the container, because when it with melting the gel, when it turns to the side, it became very, very hard to find with the ultrasound probe. So it's on my list to do, learning from May. And I'll be happy to put my email in the chat, and please feel free to reach out if you have any question anytime.
And Ruben,
so-
to answer your question, this is being recorded.
I was like, I just texted Karina. I was like, I don't know if this is recorded.
It is.
Cool. And then I think the very last few, we did put up a couple of links and just ideas of, commercial simulators that are available. Sorry, Mona, this is your slide. But some folks, I think if you have the money and if you have a sim center that is, willing to pay some money to buy a simulator for you, here are some ideas. I will say BabyWorks and HeartWorks is one of the pediatric neonatal simulators. And then EchoCom has been really great. I think that's a lot of what you'll see at some of the conferences, but there are a couple too. And then I did put in just a few pictures. We did convince someone to buy BabyWorks for us. So this is what it looks like. And we do use it in our teaching too. So this is one of our pediatric cardiac intensivists kind of using the Phantom or using BabyWorks to teach cardiac POCUS. And then a couple of other commercially available, they are more durable. This cardiac POCUS Phantom is it's huge and you could probably poke it many, many, many times. But this one was something like $3,600 compared to the $10 gelatin Phantom that I made, for instance. So just some ideas, and wanted to show what the commercial Phantoms actually do look like, since they're doing a Phantom talk, but just some ideas. The CAE cardiac simulator Phantom was the one that I just showed in that block. That was the 3,600 one. And then there are, I'm gonna go, you can't imagine that you're gonna have all these links, but I think just to know that there are a lot of commercial Phantoms out there, and we gave you some approximate prices for some of them. These are the the blue Phantom is what you think about when you think about what I think about when I think of some of the vessel training blocks. And then there's some LP simulator ones too, but so far none of them, like you said, Ruben, are really neonatal based. So I found that kind of hard. The idea is similar, but they're not exactly the same.
May, we've got a question in the chat.
Oh, how much is BabyWorks?
Yeah.
BabyWorks came out to be something like $56,000. We got a grant through our institution to support it. Yeah, it's every time my fellows use it, I'm like, careful, guys, careful. But I will say that we do have a sim center here that's really nice, that works really closely with us. And they were willing to put it as a budget request, and we actually did get approval to buy BabyWorks through the sim center as well. But since we had gotten that grant, we opted not to get a second BabyWorks because they wanted to use it for other stuff. So yeah. And then I will just say, I will give a plug to my group. Utilize your resources, build your team. Our sim center, we use our sim center a lot. When we do our little POCUS boot camp for our fellows, we use the sim center space. So that's been really nice. And a couple of my colleagues, Dennis, who's in pediatric cardiology, Michelle and Keith are my fellow neonatologists, and Katie Nahan, who's in Peds EM, has been really crucial in helping our POCUS program. And I know Mona has her incredible team as well.
Thank you. So these pictures are from Baylor. So I started solo basically, and we trained fellows and trained attendings, and now we have our learners as instructors for our workshops. And I have the graduating fellow who's now an attending, and he's the assistant program director for POCUS. So it has been fun, and the whole idea of giving this talk is just really make sure that you make sure that it's pleasant and enjoyable experience for your learners. Be creative, make it fun for learners and instructors as well. That's how you're gonna build your team when they are having fun learning and joining your team to help with the workshops and the educational activities. There's a question about SonoSim. We actually use SonoSim as well, but SonoSim simulation is virtual, so it's not really the hands-on on phantoms like you would want to have to your learners. So it's a screen, and everything that they do with the needle is all through this virtual rope. So I feel like the phantom adds to the educational process more than the virtual simulation with just the SonoSim simulation only.
Well, I know we're 5 minutes past 5 on a Friday. Does anyone else have any other questions? Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you, May, and everyone.
Thank you, May and Mona, for presenting. This was amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank,
Thanks for having us.
thank you, Mona and May. It was nice. Answered several questions. So thank you.